Okay, we're recording now. Hello to those of you who are here live and those of you who are watching the recording. Before we start class today, it's very important that we do these spot evaluations, these teaching evaluations. They're very important for the department, and they're also very important for me as a teacher. So the way that you can access them here, as I've pulled up on the Canvas page, is to go down to this tab called Feedback on Teaching. So, um, for both of you who are here presently, and for those of you who are watching the recording, I'm going to allot 10 minutes here at the beginning of class for you to fill these out. Again, they're very important for both our department and for me as a teacher. So the current time here is 12:37. I will allot 10 minutes for this, and we will resume class at 12:47. Okay? So please begin. Thank you. Okay, everybody, thank you for attending to this important matter. Uh, I look forward to reading your feedback when when the semester is over. Like I said, it's very important. Um, okay, so we're gonna go back into W.E.B. Du Bois today. Um, we sort of left off. Assume you can all see my screen still. Holler at me if you can't see my screen. We sort of left off with talking about Du Bois's key concepts, and like I said, his biography is a very important part of why Du Bois is significant, and his biography had a decisive influence on the kind of sociology that he did. So we're gonna sort of like look into um, this biography, which is, I believe, where we left off last time. Um, I believe last time we left off here with I talked about Du Bois's writing style, and then the reasons that he has been sort of like unfairly not recognized as a founder of sociology. And then here, of course, the editors take us into a sort of a biographical sketch. So I spoke on this a little bit last class, but it's important to kind of contextualize Du Bois's, kind of early life. It talks about him having been born in this place, Great Barrington, Massachusetts, um, which, obviously in the Northeast, um, the relationships of racism at the time in America were strong everywhere, but not as intense or necessarily like as violent as they were in the South. So Du Bois grew up in a relatively tolerant place in the Northeast, as he says here, like, the color line was manifest and yet not absolutely drawn in Great Barrington. Um, so, it's not that it wasn't there, but it certainly was not as intense as what he would experience when he went to the South. By all, by all accounts, Du Bois was another one of these people we've studied this semester who are just remarkable, like child prodigies. Um, Max Weber was certainly this way. I think that, you know, with Max Weber, it said like he had written his first historical essay when he was like 13 years old. It says here that by the age of 16, Du Bois had formulated the basic premise of the social and political philosophy that would guide him for the rest of his years. Keep in mind, he lived another like 79 years after that. He lived to be the age of 95. So this is, pretty remarkable. Um, I don't know what you were doing when you were 16 years old, but I was not formulating the basic premise of the social and political philosophy that would guide me for the rest of my life. I was just, being a 16-year-old dumbass and trying to get my driver's license. Um, so Du Bois, was needless to say, very far ahead of his time, and in very rarefied air as a student, and somebody who, from a very young age, was very driven and ambitious. And we'll see that he wrote a remarkable number of books and essays, and he wrote throughout his entire life. Just an enormous volume of work that came from this man, in addition to being like a lifelong activist, somebody that like founded the NAACP and was part of the Pan-Africanist movement. And, by the end of his life, he had gone to Ghana to help develop an African encyclopedia, and he's like 93 years old at that point. So just somebody that had just the gift of energy and drive and ambition for like his whole life. And it seems like the people around him like kind of recognized that pretty quickly. Like it says, like he was the first black graduate in his high school's history. And then shortly after his graduation, his mother suddenly died. And then, his education might have ended right then and there if it weren't for the benevolence of four liberal white men who took great interest in Du Bois and agreed to pay for his college education. And so at the end, he ends up going to Fisk University, which is a historically black college in Nashville, Tennessee. It still exists to this day. Fisk was founded in 1868, the same year that Du Bois was born, and just 3 years after the end of the Civil War. If you'll remember, I've talked about how in the years right after the Civil War, there were all of these schools that were constructed across the South because there was this sort of pent up demand, this thirst for literacy and knowledge and education, because the enslaved people had been denied that their whole lives in a really violent kind of way. And so once, emancipation happened in 1865, there was this kind of like this, huge constructions of schools at all levels, including these historically black colleges, many of which still exist to this day. Most of them are in the American South. So this is where Du Bois goes, initially, instead of like going to Harvard, where he would, he initially had wanted to go to Harvard and then would later get his PhD at Harvard. But before that, as an undergraduate, who's like 17 years old, he goes off to Fisk University in Nashville. Now, this is a very important event in Du Bois's life because it takes him to the South. And in Nashville, Tennessee, he witnesses all sorts of things that he would not have encountered in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Um, so, as he says here, recollecting on this in his autobiography, he said that he was thrilled for the first time to be among so many people of my own color, or rather of such various and such extraordinary colors, which I had only glimpsed before, but who it seemed were bound to me by new and exciting eternal ties. So he is surrounded with a black community in Nashville, Tennessee, in a way that he had not encountered in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, which is, a pretty small place in a part of the country that is, overwhelmingly white. And whereas Nashville was one of the largest black cities, today we think of Nashville as like, country music and all that kind of thing. But Nashville has and still does have a very large black population as well. And so this is what Du Bois is talking about as a kind of an eye-opening thing. So he's not only like furthering his education, he's also being like educated in the school of life. He is, for the first time really seeing these kinds of racial dynamics that have defined the United States in real like up close, personal, firsthand terms. So as it says here, like he started as a young man, like at this point he's still a teenager, and he starts teaching, and he's teaching, some of the, as it says here, the poorest of the black poor in a schoolhouse he described as a long hut with neither door nor furniture. Um, and so he would sort of later kind of reflect on this, in sort of his autobiography as like a formative experience in, realizing the sort of the harsh realities of poverty and racism in the South. Then at what is he at this point? 20 years old, he then goes off to Harvard. And it's here that he gets a master's degree in philosophy from Harvard in 1892, and then goes off to study in Germany, in Berlin. So it's in Germany that Du Bois encounters these methods of sociology and social scientific methods that are being developed by people like Max Weber. Max Weber, in 1892, has a whole kind of circle of colleagues around him, other German social scientists who are developing, quantitative and qualitative methods of social research. They're developing, like surveys and interviews and ethnographic methods and statistical methods. And Du Bois like soaks all of this up, in Berlin, is a 25-year-old young student, and his intention is that he wants to learn these scientific methods so that he can take them back to America and use social science, use sociology as a weapon in the struggle against racism in America, especially to combat these bogus forms of scientific racism that suggested that, Black people were in some way naturally or biologically inferior to whites. He thought that like actual good science could refute that kind of ideological bogus science, that quack science, where people would measure the skulls of different races and, try to draw some conclusion that ultimately justified and legitimated white supremacy, but, really didn't have an actual scientific basis. Du Bois thought that the things that he was learning in Germany could then, be used to basically correct the record, to show that like these forms of racism were not based in nature and biology at all, that these forms of racism were the product of society and history. At the same time that he's learning that stuff in school, he's also, as it says here, attending the local meetings of the German Social Democratic Party, which at that time was the largest socialist party in the world. Right. So Du Bois is basically being introduced to Marxism here. He's being introduced to a kind of a socialist politics, by, as it says, the largest socialist movement in the world at that time is in Germany. Now, that will become very important throughout Du Bois's life, as we will see. Du Bois, as he got older, became more and more like radical. He became more Marxist in his orientation. By the end of his life, in his 90s, he joined the Communist Party. He renounced his American citizenship and went to Africa. And that's where he died. at age 95 in 1963. So Du Bois just became more and more um, politically and socially radicalized by the way that Marxism and socialism and communism were influencing his thought. So we'll get to more of that a bit later in looking at his biography. In Europe, just like as it had happened in the South, where his experience in Nashville, Tennessee, had been this eye-opening kind of experience. Um, when he goes off to Europe, it's also a very eye-opening experience. Again, not just for like what he's learning in the classroom, but what he's absorbing in day-to-day life and the culture in general. And he talks here about, what it was like to be a black person in Germany in 1892, where he, didn't really experience the same kind of like racial prejudice. I mean, certainly the Germans are, you know, not above prejudice, but it might take more of the form of like anti-Semitism or something like that. But there wasn't the same intense, like anti-black racism that Du Bois had encountered in America. And this too would be a kind of an eye-opening experience for him to encounter white people, as it says here, who exhibited little or no racial prejudice. That kind of taught him again that like racism wasn't something that was like inherent to people of European descent. It was something that was learned. It was something that was socially and historically constructed. It was something that therefore could be unlearned, something that could be changed. And so this is what, was such the eye-opening kind of experience for Du Bois, as it is for a lot of African Americans who have gone to Europe, like James Baldwin, who went to Paris, in the 1950s and 60s, and had this same kind of epiphany about meeting white people that seemed to not have the same kind of racial prejudices that they had in America. Um, Malcolm X had this kind of an experience when he went to Mecca, as his pilgrimage as part of the Nation of Islam. When he goes off to Mecca, he sees people of all races praying together and living together and, like kind of in harmony with one another. And he had not seen that sort of thing in America. And it led Malcolm X to, sort of this understanding that like, white people weren't all just like, blue-eyed devils, as the Nation of Islam had called them. There wasn't like some evil gene that was biologically encoded into people of European descent. No, racism was in fact something that was learned, that was socially, historically, and culturally constructed. And so for Du Bois as a young man, this is a really formative experience, to witness this, as somebody for the first time. He was kind of like a fish out of water, like taken into a new environment that then made him question the environment that he had come from, the environment that he had previously had taken for granted now became something that he was questioning, and he wanted to kind of understand that now from a sociological perspective. So Du Bois um, comes back to America after his time in Germany, and basically, like, because of racial prejudice, he can't get a job teaching in America at a white, university or college, even though he's like gotten a PhD at Harvard. Um, the place where he ends up teaching is at this Wilberforce University, a small African Methodist Episcopal school in central Ohio. And there he finishes his doctoral thesis from Harvard, which is this research on the history of the African slave trade. So again, remember that one of the many things that makes Du Bois unique is his kind of international perspective on questions of slavery and colonialism and imperialism and such. And this is expressed in the very first research that he undertakes on the history of the African slave trade. Um, and then, he'll go on 2 years later and do this work on the Black community in Philadelphia, that we'll talk more about here as the lecture goes on. But basically, this will be the first study that Du Bois uses these methods that he had learned in Germany, and then applies them to studying the Black community in Philadelphia. In 1897, he goes off then to Atlanta, and spends the next 13 years at another historically Black college. Today it's called Clark Atlanta University, but back in that time it was just known as Atlanta University. And this is where Du Bois really flourishes as a social scientist. This is where he surrounds himself with other Black scholars and intellectuals, who also want to use the methods of the social sciences to study the Black community and to combat the ideological forms of racism that were around them. And so, for the next 13 years, Du Bois is at the center of what's called the Atlanta School of Sociology. And if there was any, real justice in the world, the Atlanta School of Sociology would be known as the first American school where sociology was really practiced. But it's typically overlooked, unfortunately. It does deserve more credit than it gets, for helping establish sociology in America. Typically, though, if you read say a textbook history of sociology, they usually start off with, like the University of Chicago, where it was all like white scholars, at a very prestigious university, the University of Chicago. Um, but Du Bois and his colleagues in Atlanta were doing it earlier. They were using the tools and the methods of social sciences to study the Black community. Atlanta is the largest, still is the largest Black community in the South. And so they were, doing what today would be called like urban sociology, in the way that they were attempting to document and research and interview and, do all these things to sort of describe what the Black community at the time looked like. So it's, at that point that Du Bois is starting to get noticed among the people that really notice the value of what Du Bois is doing is Max Weber. So Max Weber, really starts paying attention when Du Bois comes out with his famous book, The Souls of Black Folk. Max Weber says like, oh, this is a splendid work that ought to be translated into German. It takes a great appreciation. And then for the rest of his life, Max Weber will be highly influenced by what Du Bois was writing about America. In particular, when Max Weber writes about ethnic segregation and caste, he was very much influenced by Du Bois in that regard. Go ahead, Paige.
Yeah, I just had a quick question, and it was kind of a little random, but so I seen that he also spoke German.
Yeah.
Um and then I was also, because I kind of Googled a little bit as well. But he also wrote works in German as well. Do you know if that's kind of like a repeat of the English works, or if they're completely different?
I don't know if he wrote works in German that were not translated into English. I know that like that was when he went off to Harvard. He was basically studying like German philosophy and literature, and so in order to do that, he would have had to learn the German language, which again is just like, kind of amazing. I don't know if you've ever tried to
It's
read.
incredible. I've tried to learn Spanish and it's hard.
Yeah. I've
So
tried to learn Spanish too.
I can't imagine learning German because Spanish is fairly easy compared to German.
Yeah, like German, like the words are all like 20 letters long, and they kind of,
Yeah.
it's all these consonants, and I couldn't possibly fathom learning that
Ich
while
bin
doing all
sprechen
this other
Deutschen.
stuff. What's that?
I said, ich bin sprechen Deutschen.
No, I do not.
I took it for a
Do
semester.
you?
I'm taking it again next semester.
You
So,
are?
Oh
yeah,
my goodness.
How is that?
it's complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's
What
definitely
motivated you to
different.
do that?
Just because it was an option and I didn't want to do Spanish, which is crazy because that's what I should have done. But
Uh-huh.
I just wanted to be complicated, I guess.
Yeah, okay. I hope you get to visit Germany at some point. I've never
Yeah, they
been.
have that internship where last year with Dr. Song's class, she
Uh-huh.
took people to China, but there's that same internship that's coming up for Germany, so I'm trying to get in that.
Sweet.
Yeah.
That would be great. Yeah. Um, yeah, these things, like what we're talking about with Du Bois's biography, it's just like, you learn so much, not just like in the classroom sense, but in the experiential sense of going to another culture and visiting it. It's like one of my biggest regrets that I didn't do that when I was a college student. I didn't do like a study abroad, and I didn't travel outside of the U.S. Um, I really wish I had. All the experiences that I've had traveling ever since have been super educational for me, and it just gives you I don't know, like a wider perspective on the world. Um, and it just makes everything that, was familiar and that you take for granted, it kind of gets thrown, into question when you're traveling. It's like that thing people call culture shock, where like you just all of a sudden the things that you took for granted, like a fish in water, um, become things that you now question for the first time, if that makes sense.
Well, it's never too late. You can get on Dr. Song's tour guide. It's like super cheap and it's an experience. And you guys are
Yeah.
probably friends.
Huh?
And you guys are probably friends, so it all works out in your favor.
I have no idea. I don't know a single person at CSU Chico.
Oh, see, you got a network.
I know I've never been there. I'm not even sure I could locate it on a map. Like I mean, I kind of know where it is, but like, I certainly the only person I know is my chair, my
Oh,
boss, and you guys.
oh.
None of whom I don't think any of you actually like live anywhere close to Chico, as far as I can tell. Um, Anyway, uh, how was I like? So Du Bois, as we see, will kind of this experience with German social science will be very kind of decisive for him. Um, Thanks, Paige. I appreciate the random question. I always I don't dissuade anyone from asking a random question at any time. So it wasn't exactly random either. It was germane to
I
what was
just
going
I
on.
seen that it was talking about like the translation and I was curious about that because I'm like
Yeah,
I- it's crazy enough to speak another language but to write in it as well
yeah,
and write like full works like that's crazy.
I know. Yeah, I, when I think of these people like Du Bois and Weber, I imagine them just all just like working and studying and reading like around the clock, like with just like a candlelight or something, where they're just like intensely involved in that kind of study. And like, I'm a pretty studious person. I love to read and write, obviously, but I couldn't do that. I don't have that kind of like focus or attention or, you know, I don't have that kind of drive. Um, so hats off to them. And Du Bois, like he did that for like 95 years. And so, we see like the cumulative output of work that he produced is just astonishing. I'm always like finding out new things that he wrote that I didn't know existed. So honestly, I don't really know if all of those things that he wrote in German were translated back into English. Anyway, um, so he's at Atlanta for 13 years. He and his colleagues are doing this research in Atlanta. And then he leaves Atlanta in 1910. And then Du Bois's life is characterized by a lot of just sort of turns. He kind of goes back and forth between the academic world and the activist world. So in 1910, he goes off to into sort of the more activist world, and it's here that he becomes the founder of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is to this day I think the oldest civil rights organization in the United States. Still exists, obviously. NAACP is a big thing. So Du Bois is like, on the side, like is like founding this organization. And then he spends the next like 20 some odd years basically as an activist and somebody who's writing for this journal that the NAACP created called The Crisis. So in The Crisis, he's constantly writing articles and editorials. He's writing, like opinion pieces on the issues of the day. It gives you some of the things that he's kind of writing here. Among them, he takes up, uh, while he's doing that, he's writing several other books, some of which are autobiographical. He writes, as it says here, like 3 books about Africa during these years between 1915 and 1930. He also starts to take up the oppression experienced by Black women. And so this essay called The Damnation of Women is especially important. Um, so, he kind of takes on a more kind of intersectional approach. Now, Du Bois um, certainly had some blind spots about racism. And by all counts, he was kind of a difficult person to work with. But, he was maybe more sensitive to those issues of how race and gender intersect than others that we've looked at this semester. Was there another hand up here? It just said iPhone hand.
Oh yeah, that's me. I don't know. When I
Yep.
log in my iPhone, it don't put my name.
No
But
worries.
it's me, Precious. But
Yeah,
the boys, he started integrating into the diversity and complexities of the black woman later on in his career, correct?
yeah.
After like Carolyn and all them major hitters.
Hmm.
Okay. Just
Yeah, so he comes to the topic of women. You can see like the dates of the essays here. They're roughly between, 1910 and 1920. So in the 19 teens. So yeah, it would have been after, the other like women that we've studied, Charlotte Perkins Gilman and Marianne Weber, and after Ida B. Wells and Anna Julia Cooper. So I mean, he certainly was not like the only person taking up like how race, class, and gender were intersecting at the time. This was like,
no. Sorry, but do you think that his reasons for maybe picking it up a little later was just due to the issues at hand? Because it appears from what I've learned that race was at the forefront of people's minds before equalization of gender.
yeah. I mean, in American history, they've often gone together. So, for example, like the abolitionist movement against slavery um, kind of gave rise to the first women's movement because a lot of the people who were involved in the abolitionist movement were women. And in fact, they were probably the bulk of that movement was a movement of women and not, only of white women, but black women like Sojourner Truth. Um, and so the claims for like racial equality and gender equality in American history have been like totally interlinked at different parts. So it's hard to say
Oh,
like which
okay.
one comes first. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes a ton of sense because I'm like, I always figure, they go hand in hand. They're both a very controversial topic and a major issue.
Yeah.
But it just seems like we learn about race a lot more fluently than we do about the integration of women's rights. I mean, it's a lot
Mhm.
of it, but it's like it goes hand in hand, but it's taught separately.
Yeah. It might be, because like to teach, this is what makes an intersectional approach sometimes harder to teach because it's harder to put all things together, at the same time, and easier to kind of like analytically separate something, mm, which is what like Max Weber did with his tools of what do you call it? The ideal types. Um, yeah, I know what you mean, Precious. Um, a lot of times the way that it's worked out in American history has been like, women raise demands for racial equality, whether it was like against slavery or then like later in the 1960s, it was like for the civil rights movement. Again, like in the civil rights movement, women were really kind of the backbone of like the rank and file in the civil rights movement, white women and black women. And then those women who are involved in those movements are, also like, oh, we're also experiencing like this gender depression, and like, what about equality for us? And so they begin to like use the activist tools that they've learned in the struggle against racial oppression to then combat gender oppression. And that happened, both in like the 1850s and in the 1960s. And I would say, to some extent, all the way to this day with Black Lives Matter and movements like that. So, like, yeah, in reality, racial and gender oppression, tend to kind of go together, and they also get like resisted together at the same time. Um, and and yet, like when teaching these subjects, it's often um, easier to kind of like separate them. So I don't know if that totally answers your question, Precious, but that's like my perspective on it. I definitely like I know what you mean. Uh,
Yeah, it does. It really answers it, and it kind of bloats my head because just like a woman, you give us a stick and we'll make a nest. We're like the bomb.
right on. I never heard that expression before. Build a home. Okay, let me spend the last like 10 minutes. We're almost done with his sort of like biography. I mean, the man did live 95 years old, so like, it takes a while to weave through his life, but I want to make sure to get to that. And then in the next week's classes, we'll be looking at like his empirical sociological work, starting with his research on Philadelphia. So from like 1910 to 1934, he's like, at the head of the NAACP, and he's writing for this journal called The Crisis. He's writing about all these racial issues that are happening in America. And then, there's a sort of like an internal struggle within NAACP, and he's kind of like decides to take a leave of absence, and then he goes back to academia. He goes back to Atlanta University, where he becomes the professor and chair of the Department of Sociology. Now, in 1934, Du Bois intellectually will be drawn more towards Marxism. And this is not a coincidence, and he's certainly not alone. In the 1930s, of course, this is the decade of the Great Depression. I think in 1934, the unemployment rate was like 25%. You have just mass suffering from this economic crisis. And it leads a lot of people to Marxism in the same way that, like, after the financial crisis in 2008, people also looked to Marx to understand, like, basically, like, what's wrong with capitalism? Why does capitalism, periodically implode in this kind of way? Why is there always like a crisis, periodically in the history of capitalism? The most consistent thing is that, that there are these depressions and recessions. And so Du Bois is drawn to Marxism like a lot of other people are. A lot of other scholars and a lot of other activists are looking to Marxism for answers. And here, this will influence what is my favorite book, and I'll hopefully get a chance to speak on about on Monday, is the book Black Reconstruction. So this will influence the writing of that text in the 1930s. He will take basically a Marxist approach to understanding what had happened to America after the Civil War. So he will look back to this period of Reconstruction, roughly between 1860 and 1880. He'll do it from a historical perspective in the 1930s, and he'll do it from a perspective that is very much shaped by a Marxist critique of capitalism and social class. So we'll sort of have to say more about that next time. Um, for the last like 20 years of his life, this is where Du Bois is becoming more and more kind of like radicalized. He is writing about colonialism and imperialism. He's bringing class and race together. He is more and more supporting socialism and the unity of of African or people of African descent, whether they live in America or the Caribbean or in Africa. There's a call for sort of Pan-African unity that Du Bois is very much involved with. And so in the 1940s and 1950s, he's becoming more and more radicalized and moving further to the political left. As we will see, this gets him in trouble with the US government. He's basically on trial in the United States in the early 1950s during the period that's known as McCarthyism. Du Bois is facing like 5 years in prison, basically because he's a communist. And he is like acquitted at that trial. And then after that is when he moves to Africa, to Ghana, where he will spend the rest of his life. Yeah. So here, this gives you his sort of like his testimony that he gave at his trial. Like it says, this was the peak moment of McCarthyism, these like witch hunts in which communists were persecuted for their support of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And so, Du Bois is like at this point, like 80 years old. Actually, like 83 or 84. And he's on trial, facing 5 years in a federal prison, basically just for his beliefs. He is found not guilty. And at that point, he, as they say, decides to get the fuck out of Dodge and goes to Ghana to be with the newly elected president, Nkrumah. And Nkrumah basically invites him to, work on this encyclopedia of African culture and African history. And this is how he will spend his last years. He also, at this point, at the age of 93, he officially joins the Communist Party. And then, he, as this quote makes very clear, the way that Marxism had influenced him, and also, the course of events that he had lived through made him more and more like kind of radicalized. And so in one of his last statements, he says, capitalism cannot reform itself. It is doomed to self-destruction. No universal selfishness can bring social good to all. Communism, the effort to give all men what they need and to ask of each the best they can contribute, that is the only way of human life. In the end, communism will triumph. I want to help bring that day. The path of the American Communist Party is clear. It will provide the United States with a real third party and thus restore democracy to this land. That latter part obviously did not come true. But his critique of capitalism, you can see, is very damning. And he basically came to the conclusion that the only way forward was encapsulated in this statement that Marx had made, that communism um, would be a society in which we would have from each according to their abilities and to each according to their needs. So people would contribute to society based on whatever capabilities or abilities or skills or knowledge they had. That would be their contribution to society. And in turn, they would uh, receive whatever they needed, with the idea that everybody has different, kinds of needs. That's what's basically Du Bois is paraphrasing here when he says the effort to give all men what they need and to ask of each the best they can contribute. So it's at this point, that Du Bois basically like can't come back to America. Um, he, as it says here, it was illegal for members of the Communist Party to possess an American passport. So that meant that if Du Bois came back to America, basically he would be subject to 10 years of imprisonment. So he spends his remaining years in Africa and in Ghana and renounces his American citizenship. Remember that, well, perhaps you don't know, like Ghana was a newly created nation after, the sort of the breakup of the European colonies, the way that Europe had colonized Africa, and those, uh, you know, peoples basically weren't didn't become like independent nations until like after World War II, when the European colonies began to basically kind of retreat. So that's how, Du Bois will kind of like spend the rest of his life. And as I'm trying to lay out a sort of a trajectory where, you know, intellectually and politically, he just kept moving further and further to the left, and was really strongly influenced by what he learned from Marxism, especially, with the idea of how like capitalism and white supremacy were, historically always interlinked, and likewise how class and race, were always like fundamentally intertwined with one another. So that's where we're going to pick up in the next class. We'll start with you know talking about this work called the Philadelphia Negro, and I'll kind of like um, try to highlight some of that. I'm a little bit behind as far as the discussion of the readings, but I think that we'll make up for it, because the last week of readings are also just from the Du Bois's writings themselves. And, I think we can go through those at a little bit faster of a pace. Thank you again for today for filling out the evaluations. Thank you for your questions, comments, and even random questions. I'm always welcome to. I always appreciate having some feedback, interaction, and dialogue. Always makes class more of an enjoyable thing for me. So I thank you for that. Until then, I wish you a good weekend. And well, it's not really the weekend yet. I mean, it's only Wednesday, but let's just pretend like it's the weekend. It's like, if we decide it's the weekend, it can become the weekend. At any rate, I will see you next week on Monday, December the 8th. And until then, I bid you adieu. Have a great day, everyone. Bye bye.